Everybody, this is Hiranyo Nath at Sam Houston State University, Huntsville, Texas, United States of America. I wish I could be with you all in Bhubaneswar. Today, the title of my presentation is Services Trade in Emerging Market Economies. This is a joint work with Dr. Nath&Mandal at Assam University, Silchar, India. As I understand, this conference is primarily focusing on micro aspects of global business environment. However, in this presentation, I am going to give you a macro perspective on international trade in services in emerging market economies. In this presentation, our primary goal will be to discuss the current trends in services trade in emerging market economies in general, and in information-intensive services in particular. By information-intensive services, we mean those services which involve creating, processing, and transmitting information. More specifically, we will discuss some background of trade in services because services trade is relatively new. We will discuss current trends in world trade, focusing on trade in services. We will briefly discuss trends and composition of services trade in emerging market economies. We will give some tentative explanations for the growth of trade in information-intensive services. Finally, we will discuss the implications for policy and strategy. Let me give you some brief background. Historically, little attention has been paid to trade in services. One of the defining characteristics of services is that they are co-produced by producers and consumers. Thus, in the past, when communication technologies were not well developed, the production of services required physical presence of both producers and consumers in the same location. Therefore, it was almost inconceivable that services could be traded. In fact, services were largely considered as non-tradable. Furthermore, agriculture and then manufacturing were the predominant sectors of the economy. Many services were just activities auxiliary to the production of goods, and many others were simply not marketed. Consequently, even the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, GATT, which was the forum for multilateral trade negotiations, was almost entirely about merchandise trade. The services that accompany the movements of goods and people across borders were perhaps the first services in human history to be traded across borders. Countries started recognizing the importance of services trade only in recent times. With the deregulation of its airline industry in the late 1970s, the United States started negotiating the open sky deals with many countries around the world. Further, increasing presence of American banks and entertainment industries overseas made the US recognize its comparative advantage in services and the potential for trade in services with. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the European Common Market also recognized the importance of services trade among the member states as well as with the rest of the world. Now, if you look at the advanced countries, for last few decades, these countries have moved towards becoming service economies. Services have become the most important source of income and employment. Further, information-intensive services have become the largest segment of the advanced economies, primarily due to advances in information and communication technologies. Cross-border trade in many services has become possible. In 1980s, concerted efforts were made to bring trade in services into the realm of multilateral trade negotiations. Primarily due to this effort, the General Agreement on Trade in Services (GATS) came into effect on January 1st. Since, unlike merchandise trade, services trade needs to encompass a wide range of international transactions, the GATS takes a broad view of trade in services. Thus, the definition of trade in services that GATS uses includes four categories of transactions: cross-border trade, services supplied across borders, for example, electricity, telecommunication, transportation; consumption abroad, services supplied in a country to foreigners, for example, tourism, education abroad; commercial presence, services supplied in a country by foreign business establishments, for example, restaurant chains, hotel chains; the presence of natural persons, services supplied in a country by foreign nationals, for example, visiting entertainers. Now, statistical agencies around the world have started using this framework to collect and compile data on international trade in services. As a result, the quality of services trade data has improved, although a lot is yet to be done in this respect. Now, in this presentation, in the next few slides, we will be using the available data available from WTO. First, let's look at how the world trade in goods and services have evolved over time. So if we look at goods trade, back in 1980, the total value of goods trade was about 2 trillion US dollar, which was about 18% of world GDP. In 2013, that value increased to about 19 trillion dollar, which was about 25% of world GDP. Over the years, the value of goods trade increased at an average annual growth rate of 6.8%. If we look at trade in commercial services, it was $367 billion in 1980, which was about 3.3% of world GDP. In 2013, the value of commercial services trade increased to 4.6 trillion US dollar, which was about 6.1% of world GDP. During this period, the value of commercial services trade increased at an annual growth rate of 7.7%, so which is higher than the annual average growth rate of trade in goods. Now we direct our attention to emerging market economies. We use the most recent reports by 5 different agencies: MSCI, FTSE, S&P Dow Jones, BBVA Research, and Russell Investment, to compile a list of 21 emerging market economies. They are Brazil, Chile, China, Colombia, Czech Republic, Egypt, Hungary, India, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, Poland, Qatar, Russia, South Africa, Thailand, Turkey, and United Arab Emirates. Most of the data that we use for our analysis come from the World Trade Organization Commercial Services Trade Database. We also look at data for 12 different services trade items. They are transportation, travel, telecommunication, construction, insurance services, financial services, computer and information services, royalties and license fees, other business services, personal, cultural, and recreational services, audiovisual and related services. Among these services, if we apply our definition of information intensive services, we would say computer and information services, insurance services, financial services, other business services are some of the examples of information intensive services. Now, if we look at how exports and imports of commercial services in the emerging market economies have evolved, we find that exports of commercial services back in 1980 from these 21 EMEs were about $28 billion, which was about 8% of total world services exports. And imports were about $34 billion, which was about 8% of the total imports of services in the world. Now, over time, this value and these values and these shares have increased, and by 2013, the total exports from these 21 EMEs were $943 billion, which was about 21% of the total commercial services exports in the world, and imports were about $1.2 trillion, which is about 28% of the total services imports in the world. If we look at growth, of course, exports and imports, they grew faster in early 1990s and again in 2000s with dips during the financial and global economic crisis. Now, if we look at the leading exporters and importers of commercial services among these 21 EMEs in 2013, we will find that China is the leading exporter as well as importer of commercial services. It accounts for about 22% of total exports from these 21 emerging market economies and about 28% of total imports into these 21 emerging market economies. China is followed by India. Of course, India's share in total exports of commercial services is higher than its share in imports of commercial services. Again, the third place in terms of export goes to Republic of Korea. In case of imports, it goes to Russia. Russia is fourth in export of commercial services. Korea is fourth in imports of commercial services. Thailand is fifth among these 21 countries in the export of commercial services, and Brazil is fifth in the import of commercial services among these 21 countries. Now let me draw your attention to the largest service trade items between 2000 and 2013. We look at both export items and import items. There are too much information in this slide, so let me ask you to pay attention to those colored boxes. For example, first let's focus on those yellow boxes where I have listed the largest export items in 2000 and 2013 in Brazil, China, and India. These are the three largest emerging market economies among this group of EMEs. In Brazil, it used to be other business services. In even 2013, it is other business services. However, the share in total services exports has gone up from 51 to 55%. In China, it used to be travel. Now it is other business services. In India, it used to be other business services. Now it is computer and information services. Now, the most important thing to recognize here is that other business services includes a number of services which are information intensive services. In other words, these three largest EMEs has become exporter of information intensive services. If you look at those orange color boxes, there you will find that more traditional non-information intensive services are the largest export items from Chile, Colombia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Indonesia, Peru, and Philippines, but their share has gone down. If you look at the growth of information intensive services in those countries, which I don't present in the table, you will find that correspondingly the share of those information intensive services has gone up. Now if you look at the right hand side columns, those which I have highlighted in green or in blue, the green ones are the countries where they have become importers of more information intensive services. For example, in Brazil, transportation used to be the largest import item. Now it is other business services. In Hungary, in both the time period, it is other business services. However, the share of other business services has gone up from 37% to 40%. In Korea, it used to be transportation. In 2013, it is other business services. Now, if you look at those blue colored boxes, there you will see that those are non-information intensive services in both the years, but their share has fallen over the years. Correspondingly, the share of information intensive services in those countries have increased. So this table basically tells us that the share of information intensive services in the exports from the emerging market economies and the share of information intensive services in imports into the emerging market economies have increased over the years. Now the question is why trade in information intensive services has increased in emerging market economies. Since we don't do a formal analysis, we will call them tentative explanation. The first and foremost, the unprecedented advances in information and communication technology have played a pivotal role in the expansion of trade in information intensive services. In fact, according to some studies, which includes my two published paper with Dr. Lirong Lu, ICT advances contribute positively to the growth of trade in goods as well as in services. There are direct and indirect channels through which ICT advances can stimulate trade in information intensive services. The most direct way is by lowering the cost of communicating information or transferring data. The low cost not only helps with the actual delivery of the service, but also with the entry into the market in another country. Further, there are indirect channels through which ICT contributes to the growth of trade in information intensive services. For example, ICT enabled service innovations such as geographically dispersed production of service components, of which service outsourcing is an example, and assembly have tremendous implication for service trade. Secondly, rising standard of living and economic size of these emerging market economies have also contributed to the growth of information intensive services. The range and complexity of economic activities in those economies create vast demand for a number of information intensive services. Now, to understand this potential for demand creation, we can use this figure from Quinn 1992 that shows how the size and growth of manufacturing can create demand for a host of services. As we can see in this figure, manufacturing is directly supported by value-added services like financing, leasing, and insurance, business services like consulting, auditing, and advertising, and distribution services like wholesaling, retailing, and repairing. These support services are further backed by infrastructure services, government services, and personnel services. Many of these support services, particularly the information intensive services, can be traded across borders. Foreign direct investment in services sector in these emerging market economies has also contributed to the growth of exports and in some cases imports of information intensive services. In fact, there are a number of examples in India. There have been bilateral trade agreements between countries regarding services trade, although the multilateral trade agreements has not trade negotiations have not progressed well. The deregulation of service industries, home and abroad, and liberalization of foreign trade and investment regimes in general around the world provide the impetus for growth in services trade. Service industries are heavily regulated, and therefore it is often very difficult to attract foreign investment and trade. Recognizing the enhanced tradability of services due to technology, many governments around the world have deregulated a number of information intensive services, primarily to increase competition and gain efficiency. Finally, unlike in merchandise trade, language and culture are very important in services trade. For consumer services, which are information intensive, the topography of the world, trade, and outsourcing will be strongly colored by language, culture, and colonial history. In fact, the defining feature of this topography is language and not mountains and oceans, and the language barrier may well be the hard thing to cross. As this figure shows, the distribution of world population for 5 major languages into different income ranges measured by GNP per capita. It shows that the world English market for service is unique in its size, geographic distribution, and most importantly in potential for trade. It is also one of the most open market. Spanish shares some of these features, but the distribution being less extreme offers less opportunity for those in poorer countries. For other major language groups concentrated in one or a few countries, the potential for outsourcing and international trade would be rather limited. This might well prove to be a boon for those engaged in services in those countries, since they will not be subject to the intense competition seen due to outsourcing and offshoring in English and perhaps the Spanish worlds. We do not claim that all these tentative explanations that we have provided are exhaustive, and there are further rooms for future research. In conclusion, what we try to convey is that there are several challenges as the trade in information intensive services increase in emerging market economies. First of all, infrastructure. Not all emerging market economies have well-developed infrastructure for the services trade that we have seen. Cybersecurity, which is one of the focus area of this conference. So as the information intensive services trade increases from and to the emerging market economies, while they use the information and communication technology as the vehicle of trade, and of course they are subject to, or they are susceptible to these issues of cybersecurity. Then these are all new developments, and we do not have, or the emerging markets do not have the sufficient institutional framework to deal with some of the issues or some of the problems that are created or that arise as the service trade grows. The multilateral trade negotiations have not progressed enough to for that will be beneficial for a healthy growth of the services trade. Finally, as a result of this growth in services trade, whether there will be convergence or conflicts of culture, that is something to be seen. And with that thoughts, we would say thank